It's the Redbird Reboot podcast. Are you ready to get rebooted, Cardinals fans? He settles down, at least in the zone, and does not stop running.
Blake Murphy.
This is the identity for the Arizona Cardinals.
The run defense is just horrendous, and it's been horrendous for the Cardinals for a long time.
And Marcos Labrada.
He's going to bring over his philosophy. It should make it better.
Present the hottest NFL podcast from the country's hottest state.
He should be turning around the logo.
Actually, some breaking news we can cover here. This popped up just about, 6 minutes ago.
It's Redbird Reboot.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans. Welcome into the Redbird Reboot podcast. We're airing here live on X and YouTube, at least. We've got right now some big news that we'll talk about today, at least, with a certain Arizona Cardinals tight end that is now the highest paid tight end in NFL history. In Trey McBride, we've got a reunion for a longtime Arizona Cardinal and future Ring of Honor member, maybe. And we also get to talk a little about some of the team's top 30 visits and maybe finish up with another temperature mock draft, something that's a little different from what you may have seen. So we get started. I'm Blake Murphy, Blake Murphy 7, and this, of course, is Pancake Soul Marcos Labrada. Marcos, you've got some great news if you're a Cardinals fan the last couple of days. For the most part, it's been an interesting week. How are you doing?
Well, today, because I heard the breaking news about Trey McBride finally getting his big major contract, being the highest paid tight end in the league. And that's how it works all the time. It always goes up with every single person that gets paid. You get the next highest paid, you get the next highest paid. So it just keeps going on up and stuff. That's just a way for the Cardinals to be able to signal to Trey McBride that not only he was very important to our offense, but it also signals to him that we want him to stay.
Absolutely no. And McBride at least set a record last year for most receptions without an actual receiving touchdown. He obviously had the fumble touchdown and a rushing touchdown. But for what we know, at least with McBride, it is definitely a 4-year deal, highest paid tight end in NFL history. I'll be able to talk a little bit about what that means, but it makes sense when you consider the fact that he is just 25, I think so, years old, unless I'm mistaken there. And he's getting paid at $19 million a year on average. Right now, Travis Kelce, the all-world NFL tight end, it's at $17 million a year. Obviously, age is something that you're seeing play out with the Cardinals. It does come into touch over George Kittle, who is, I believe, the last tight end that got a contract like this. It's a 5-year extension worth $75 million. So you're talking about higher overall average per year annual value, higher overall annual actual value, and it is a market-setting deal. It is still, what most people would say, for the value that he brings to the Cardinals offense, to be under $20 million a year, just shows you that the tight end position is not quite like the $30 million a year for wide receivers. It's not the $50 million a year for quarterbacks. And by all accounts, it is a well-deserved contract. What were the first thoughts that you had, Marcos, when you saw this? Because for me, it felt like what we know about Arizona, under Michael Bidwell, they will pay their stars. And we knew that this was something that they wanted to get done. They were able to wrap it up. And they didn't have much competition. There's no other large tight end contracts out there right now. So Arizona's in a unique nature of kind of being able to set the market with a star that is homegrown that they drafted.
Yeah, and it's funny because I keep going to back to like when he was drafted, a lot of people didn't want him. And he also mentioned that. He said, I remember what the fan base was saying and whatnot. But hearing this, first off, I thought it's about time. And second of all, I thought to myself, so what are the numbers going to look like in how many years? But it's kind of strange that they don't earn as much as wide receivers do, because it's hard to find a tight end that's like an elite level tight end. I think when it comes to wide receivers, you might have a lot of those out there in the league. I mean, there's going to be, the Jamar Chases, of course, and there's going to be a difference between that and a Devontae Smith. But, they pretty much bring the same value when it comes to the passing game. But tight ends that can catch the ball, they can go for a lot of yards, and they can also block just like he does. That's not something you find. So that's why, to me, it's like it's harder to find an elite tight end than it is to find an elite wide receiver.
Right. One of the things that we can note about last year's was Brock Bowers, at least, was a guy who actually had a few more. I think yards and receptions than McBride. He had 1,194 with 112 catches. So basically he basically had one catch for like some 50 yards more than McBride did with 5 touchdowns. What you're looking at, though, is when it comes down to how you build out an NFL roster, you're right that Bowers is kind of that move sort of tight end where you can block in line, but that's not going to be his bread and butter. You're going to want him out running routes from the slot like a big slot receiver, being that possession guy. McBride's advantage with the Cardinals since they drafted him is that he can do all of that stuff, and he also is a very good blocking tight end as well. One of the things that he's improved each year that we've seen has been that ability to block. We saw Arizona run most 12 and 13 personnel in the NFL this past year. And when it comes to looking at the overall PFF receiving grade, he was the top receiving grade, at least for the Arizona Cardinals. When it came down to pass blocking, he was right there behind offensive linemen with a positive grade. And when it came down to the run blocking grade, he was right up there along with the likes of Paris Johnson, James Conner, and he was pretty close to Marvin Harrison Jr. He is one of the critical Cardinals that they need to be able to keep around. He's going to be in the prime of his career, like we talk about most tight ends. The prime of their career usually ends up happening between ages 23 to about 29. Sometimes guys will hit 30, and it can wear and tear on you. It's a lot of heavy pushing, blocking, a lot of having to make different catches, requires a lot of athleticism. And he has been consistent in how he has played within the Cardinals over the past couple of years. So you're talking about a healthy receiver who's also able to be a dominant blocker, and makes sense why he would get paid this item. Tremendous for the Cardinals to keep one of their own guys. This is one of those moves that, like we said, no-brainer. Didn't think there was any issues with working it out. Glad they were able to actually get it done.
Yeah, me too. And it's coming on back-to-back days where not only did we sign our tight end to the highest, obviously to the highest contract annually and of course guaranteed, but also we brought back an old Arizona Cardinal that was a fan favorite in Calais Campbell. So hearing that in back-to-back like days is like it's just awesome. I can't ask for more. I've been wanting Calais to come back.
Yeah, it is a banner day for Cardinals fans. It originally happened on, you'll say, the April Fool's Day, and so it came from the team accounts. You're like, all right, this is like legitimate. We had mentioned this as a possibility for the past couple of years when Calais had actually left. I believe it was the Jacksonville Jaguars after that 17.5 sack season. He spent a couple of years with the Baltimore Ravens on a deal, and then kind of became a mercenary defensive line, was still one of the more efficient run defenders, and even got in, I think it was about 8 or so sacks. It was probably the best defensive lineman for the Falcons after Grady Jarrett went down in 2003, and he was on the Miami Dolphins 2024 squad, which I believe that this past year they just missed out on being able to get a playoff game, and I believe also a playoff win. So the fact that he's back in Arizona on what's actually a pretty good deal for him overall. So Calais is back on a $5 million deal for 1 year, and he has about an opportunity to get, I think it was $7 million at least, or incentives. And you're talking about not just one of the all-time Cardinal greats, but one of the longest tenured players in the National Football League. He's going to turn 39 this year. He played effective last season at 38, played all 17 games at 37 and 38. He is the only remaining, I believe, player in the NFL who also played in that 2008 Super Bowl showdown between the Arizona Cardinals and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Just shows you that was probably about 17 years ago. When you think about it, it's like it's hard to think through, but this is 2025. You add 10, you add 7 years. Just been an incredible career, and they add him in as the, I mean, you can't really get more veteran than probably like the oldest defensive lineman in the NFL, and he's on what looks to be probably starting money. It's not like he's going to come in and be a backup or just coming in for a token deal. The Cardinals are coming in expecting him to make an impact next to the likes of Dalvin Tomlinson. Just something that's going to be unique about Calais Campbell is that he's the only Arizona Cardinal now to play with both Kurt Warner and Kyler Murray, except for, of course, the legendary Larry Fitzgerald, part of that 2008 Super Bowl class as a rookie. And when you take a look at his overall career, it's just been stunning as far as for what we're able to see. So you're talking about being able to have a solid career with about an average of 5 or 6 sacks a season with Arizona, kind of exploding up through the Bruce Arians years where he was that valued captain. Was able to be an all-pro player selection twice, as well as a Pro Bowl. Goes to Jacksonville and has 14 and a half sacks. You get the extra 3, I believe, from the postseason that offseason, including, I believe it was a one. I think it was defensive interception, which it was in 2016 when the Cardinals had the most sacks in the NFL with him across from Chandler Jones. He was a guy that they just could not pay the price tag to be able to keep him for that $30 million a year. They also were looking at him entering that age 30 season going to Jacksonville. And since he's left the Cardinals, he's had an 8-year career. Some guys are lucky if they get to 8 years in the National Football League. Calais has done that twice. Now, of course, the question's going to be, now that we see these defensive lineman positions added, a lot of people are wondering, how is that going to impact the draft? How does it impact the team? The one thing that we know for sure, Markers, is it's going to impact jersey sales because people are going to be able to bust out that old Calais Campbell out of their closet, number 93. Looks like, I think poor Justin Jones, who's been wearing that this last year, maybe it was Bilal Nichols, is probably going to end up having to, get a little bit of compensation to give that up. But we're going to see 93 jerseys back in the stands for Cardinals fans. See one of those like living legends back on the team in a very critical year in which the Cardinals are pushing for a playoff berth.
Yeah, and he's still that's the crazy thing about Calais Campbell is it's something that I am so astonished. He's still very productive. The guy still gets around 5+ sacks as defensive end. So you have your defensive end / defensive tackle usually average around 5 to 6 sacks and whatnot. That's the higher end. But to be able, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, the thing that's interesting also about them, like you said, modern, it's not like you're getting a shell of Calais Campbell. If you take a look at last year, Calais would have been the highest graded overall defensive player for Pro Football Focus for the Arizona Cardinals. So an overall grade of 82 for the defensive side. His run defense was actually one of the best in the NFL. He was 6th out of 118. Zaven Collins was very, very close to him, 29th out of 119. They do play different positions, but you're talking at least about right up the middle, being one of the best run stoppers. It just adds to your ability as an Arizona Cardinals fans to be able to say, hey, we're got some young stars at least that are kind of burgeoning with Garrett Williams. You've got another young corner or two with Max Melton. Obviously, you've got the other older star in Budda Baker, who gets reunited with Calais Campbell. I think that Budda was the one guy who got to play with both Carson and Kyler. Calais got to play with all three once he ends up taking up in the uniform. But yeah, it's one of those places where there's going to be a veteran presence he brings. It's not really anything wrong with it. The only thing I think that you can question is, at his age, is he going to be able to play all 17 games? We've seen that sometimes it's not necessarily the case, but regardless, this is one of those moves that you think is probably going to be the last year that Calais plays, or if he does, it'll be for one more year, because there is a limit that NFL players are able to go with just how it taxes their body. He'd considered retirement before in past years, but overall, it's one of those places where you can say the last couple of days, Cardinals fans have been eating good. I'm excited to see what impact he's going to bring to the desert, especially considering the fact that, you talk about post-career things like what kind of role could he have at least overall with Arizona? Does he still end up trying to move back out here? There's a lot that can happen, but at the end of the day, you're getting a 6'8", 280, 300-pound guy who can still get after it. And that's something that I think if the Cardinals add another young defensive lineman to kind of take over for Calais in a year, that would be something that I think we could all expect to be sort of a passing of the torch, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have Darius Robinson still in the room, so that's the perfect mentor for someone like Darius Robinson, who plays somewhat of a similar position as a defensive end slash defensive tackle, usually mostly lined up against tackles on the inner shoulder, on the outer shoulder of like the guards and whatnot. So that's where you're going to see your damage from Calais Campbell this year. And when I was looking at his PFF numbers and I was looking at like a little bit of his film, he's a really good run stuffing defensive end.
Yeah.
So that brings a lot of value, especially since our defensive line has been just horrible at stopping the run.
Yeah, the Dolphins' run defense last year was actually pretty good. Vic Fangio did leave overall when it came to the defense. He took a step back. They were able to ultimately win a Super Bowl. But when it came down to the 2024 rushing yards per game, one of the things that we got to see was that the Dolphins and Eagles are very similar in terms of total rush yards that they gave up. That's something that I think is really interesting when you're talking about like on the defensive side. As far as yards per carry in general, the Dolphins were probably somewhere ranked within the top 10. They ended up giving up, I believe it was 12 touchdowns on the ground. The team that gave up the most, of course, was the Dallas Cowboys, had all sorts of issues. And then when it came to the amount of long rushing touchdowns that they gave up, it was probably about the top 15. So you're talking at least about Calais being one of those guys on a team and a Dolphins team that now really needs a defensive tackle. I think that these two things are clear. You kind of have this wave of the future with the Trey McBride. You have a Calais Campbell. And then you have the upcoming future for the Arizona Cardinals. So one of the things that we want to at least talk about is talk about some of their top 30 visits today, but I do want to talk a little bit about with former Cardinals coach Clayton Adams today. Clayton Adams had an interesting statement he made about Kyler Murray in an interview. I believe it was with... I think it was Dallas at least today, because he's the new offensive coordinator for Brian Schottenheimer and the Dallas Cowboys. We came out on the Coach Speak Index, said that offensive line coach, I think it was, Brian Schottenheimer said Clayton Adams told Kyler Murray never really wanted to run. That was the clip. That was the case. Lots of people reacted back and forth, at least on that, because some people, this seems crazy. Other people, this seems like legitimate. Where do you think we fall, Marcos, on this? Is this a spot where Kyler needs to take off and run more for the Cardinals to be able to win games? Is that the second half slumps? Is there injuries that he can take up where he runs a little bit less? Do teams adjust a little bit more? What in the world is going on with some of this from Clayton Adams, the now former Cardinals offensive line coach?
Well, see, I think 2020 was when... That's when he had his highest mark as a runner. He had like about 800 yards or whatnot. Second year in the league, he put up really good numbers when it comes to his passing numbers and also his ground numbers. It was probably his best statistical season since he's been in the league. He used his legs quite a bit. And during the offseason of 2021, he wanted to say he wanted to win from the pocket more. And people were accepting of that because you do want your quarterback to take less hits. If you're running more and if they're taking more carries and whatnot, it wears down on the body. We saw what happened, we saw a little bit at the beginning of the season, but towards the end, you saw there was a lot of hesitancy or just not wanting to call more like run plays or design runs. We get into his third year, that's a disaster year. Kingsbury gets fired. Year after that, and then obviously Kyler Murray comes back from an injury, so you're not going to force him to have to take snaps taking any rushing snaps or anything like that. But this year, we wanted to see what was going to happen, especially since we had a run game implemented that was supposed to be a dominant run game. And I can see that there's some times where we've heard the criticism. We thought to ourselves, wait, why didn't he get any more carries than just 5 carries a game or just 3 carries a game? We know he has the explosiveness. We saw it against the 49ers when he scored that touchdown from the 40-yard line. So we know he's capable of doing it, but it always begs the question, is he doing this to protect himself, some games because he might be going up against a defense that will take his head off, or is he doing it because his body can't, isn't designed to take it and he doesn't want to risk getting an injury? That's where the question comes.
Right. And I think some of the areas, and this is kind of where we'll talk about fact or fiction when it comes to Kyler Murray and how his rushing at least goes. So the biggest thing at least with Murray is, does he run? And the answer at least is yes. Now, does he run as much as people would want or as much as he should run, I think is the question. So for that, we can kind of take a calculation, do a little bit of math and a little bit of comparison. So the quarterbacks who end up running the most in the NFL when it comes to, we're going to take a look just specifically at 2024 here, are going to be guys like Lamar Jackson, and then this year with the new addition of a Jaden Daniels. He was someone who also had a lot of rushing yards per game. Kyler actually does run on average probably about 4.5 times a game. So if we take a look at his overall rushing attempts for this past year, I got that pulled up on the screen for those of you watching live. I'll have that here in just a second. We can see that over the course of the season, the Arizona Cardinals are watching Kyler Murray run for an average of 5 attempts, 1 attempt, 7 attempts, 7 attempts, 6 attempts. He had at most 8 attempts rushing the football. This would be against Carolina in that overtime loss in which the Cardinals were not able to keep things going enough to put away the Panthers on offense, and on defense were not able to get enough. They were able to run on the Panthers like no tomorrow. Kyler ran for 63 yards in that game. When James Conner got hurt, it definitely was a bit of a hit. But you take a look at some of these close finishes that they had. The Minnesota game, 7 rushing attempts, 23, 22, close loss that kind of came down to that last series where the Vikings were able to get that late come from behind, I believe it was touchdown. We also were able to see the Green Bay game was a blowout, but in the San Francisco game that was close, that was something where he ran quite a bit, had his largest rushing attempt, and like you said, he had that long touchdown in that game of, I don't have to remember. Yeah, it was basically like the 40, I think it was 50 yards or something like that one when he ran down the field. We saw something similar in the Chargers game. So what we've seen is that in the past, Kyler would have occasionally some explosive runs for like maybe 20 yards or so. We saw some truly explosive long touchdowns this year, which we haven't seen from Kyler in quite a bit of time. And we take that 78 total rushing attempts, you divide it out by about, all 17 games worth he played. It's about 4.5 attempts per game. So we talk about 4.5 attempts per game, and you say, hey, Kyler doesn't want to run that much. Like, to me, this kind of defeats the narrative purpose. You take a look at the date and everything over time. You can say that, yeah, Kyler ran a little bit more in the first half of the season, but it's not by much. He still had a 2-attempt game, I think it was late in the season against the Seattle Seahawks. He had that 8 rushing yard game against the Panthers. And then, of course, like we can say at least earlier against the Chargers, he had 6 rushing attempts. The only game that really kind of threw off the norm was the Arizona-Chicago game, in which the Cardinals basically won the game from the outcome. The Bears just were not ready to be able to play competitive football, have since gone and cleaned house. We also saw in the Washington game in which they were blown away from the get-go, basically down like 14-0 before they even got the ball back. That was one of the other games where he had only 1 rushing attempt. They kind of just put in Clayton Tune and let him finish the game as they got destroyed in Cliff Kingsbury's homecoming. So I think when we're talking about what the expectations are for Kyler Murray, I think that the sweet spot that we're seeing, Marcos, if we take a look at his overall splits throughout the rest of his career, he's probably never going to have an 800-yard rushing game like he did in 2020. That just is not realistic for that pace. He had, I believe it was 133 attempts. He recently ramped back up to about 78. I think if you take a look at each year, his 17-game average is about 104 attempts. You're probably going to come in a little bit under that. So when the question is, should Kyler run the ball more? I think that we can all say that the answer is it kind of depends. We saw in games that he ran the ball more, that wasn't necessarily leading to a Cardinals win. It did lead to maybe a closer game. So maybe the thought process is, if the game is close, Kyler's going to run a little bit more. And if the Cardinals have a lead, it might be because they're able to either design Kyler running the ball to be able to get a score, or they're able to at least be effective on offense. That means that when they're effective on offense, teams are then saying, hey, we're going to play coverage. We need to double team McBride. We know we got to stop James Conner and the run game up front. We got to make sure we get coverage figured out on the back end. That's going to give Kyler Murray a little bit of room. We've also seen him run around behind the line of scrimmage and being able to scramble and escape some different plays. He did very well when pressured in the first half of the year last year. didn't do as well when pressured in the second half of the year. I think a healthy offensive line is part of that, Marcos. And the one thing that I'd like to see next year would be if they can say, hey, we started out in 2023, we got you 44 attempts in your last, I think it was was it 8 games of the season? We got you 78 attempts next year. I think if you can finish 2025 probably with an extra attempt per game, so you're talking about anywhere from 90 to 100, which I think would probably be more 90 to 95 would be the hopes. That's probably it. That's probably at least the sweet spot for Kyler Murray, and you're hoping then that's going to probably get about 600 or something yards for Kyler at worst. You take a look at putting that all together. If you can say you've got, hey, a 1,000-yard rusher, a 600-yard rusher, and then you can get another 300-yard rusher from your running back 3, it's pretty good as far as being able to say that it's effective enough as a run game that the Cardinals should be able to win games. And I think that you can say maybe there's an impact that Kyler makes in certain positions where he's not willing as much to be able to run and take a big hit. But at the same time, we're kind of busting this narrative a little bit now. That being said, we'll cut and take a look at some other quarterbacks like Jaden Daniels, Lamar Jackson, and Joe Burrow for their rushing attempts. But before we get to those, any thoughts that you have, Marcos, on Kyler running the ball? Something that I think we will still see this year. It's not like it's going to suddenly go away as he turns 28.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've always wanted to see is Kyler Murray execute like a bash concept. And so bash concept just basically means that the running back is motioning from one side to the other side of the formation, and the quarterback's holding the ball right in front, and he's either riding the mesh with them, which means he's running with them and is about to hand it off, or he hands it off. The way we currently run Kyler Murray when it comes into the run game is more in the pistol or something like in the shotgun, where he's handing the ball off or fake handing the ball off with the running back right next to him, or just waiting for the running back to come up. And there's different angles to attack with that. But there's the issue with the bash concept. One, it's a premeditated call. You don't make that call because you're reading the defender. The offensive coordinator is the one who determines that. But two, that means Kyler would be running up the tackles, between the tackles and whatnot.
Correct.
You really don't want to. You really don't know if you even want to see that. But it is a very big knockout like play when it's executed correctly. It can lead to like 30-yard gains, so maybe even a touchdown, like on a highlight reel that you see. That's the reason why you see Lamar Jackson just take off up the middle and just like do those crazy 40-yard gains and whatnot. But I've never seen Kyler Murray take a snap like that for obvious reasons. If you do that, that means you're making him run between the tackles.
Yep. Let's talk a little bit about why it seems like Kyler Murray is not running as much as other people are expecting. And for that, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a couple of other quarterbacks in the league, which are known as running quarterbacks, as well as just the Patrick Mahomes stats as far as how he's kind of the prototypical. No one ever talks about him as being a running quarterback, but he's one of those quarterbacks who actually does run quite a bit more than people think. The one, of course, that is the top rushing quarterback that always comes to mind for most people is going to, of course, be Lamar Jackson of the Baltimore Ravens. And the reason why is because he has a high number of rushing attempts. So in the 2024 NFL season, Lamar ran the ball 139 times. So that ran it almost twice as much as Kyler Murray did. As far as rushing attempts, his first game of the year, he ran 16 times for 122 yards. You can see, at least as far as his yards per attempt, he's going to be kind of averaging up in the, well, I guess 21 is pretty high because he only ran it, what was that? I think it was one time at least for the most part, or 4 attempts for 87 yards with a nice long score. But you're talking at least ultimately about someone who is going to average higher rushing numbers. Instead of seeing the 4, 5, 6, and 7, you're going to see occasional times of 14, times of 12, times of 9, times of 11. These standout games, I think, are part of with what drives the average up, where you can say that Lamar is probably going to average, instead of Kyler Murray having his 4.5 per season, you're talking about Lamar Jackson averaging, let me do my math here real quick, be 8 attempts per game. You look at a quarterback who is a rookie in Jaden Daniels, who ran the ball 148 times per game, including 2 times he ran the ball 16 attempts in those games. Lowest was about 3 or 4. So you're talking about Jaden Daniels in all 17 games, then running the ball about almost 9 times per game. Now, this isn't the case for every successful quarterback in the National Football League. When we take a look at Patrick Mahomes in the 2024 NFL season, he ran the ball 58 times, so less than Kyler Murray did as far as his overall rushing yards. He only had 307. Most of his running we got to see was kind of missing from some of their playbook this year. They didn't have great protection. It took a while for guys to get downfield. Mahomes could still run around to buy time, but you can see at least with how it worked, he just eventually made a use of not having his high sack numbers, taking a few sacks per game, using his athleticism not to run the ball forward, but to be able to simply avoid some of those sacks. And then a quarterback like Joe Burrow, who has athleticism but doesn't have necessarily the running quarterback build, ran the ball, I think it was 42 times for only 200 yards. So when you're talking about a quarterback here, and we can talk about with the likes of, I think it would be Jalen Hurts did this year, which was kind of unique in terms of his stats. That's the only other quarterback that kind of tests into this sort of dual threat model that has tons of success. Now, it's on the best team in the NFL as far as the Eagles go, and he had about 150 rushing attempts per this season, so very close to the likes of Jaden Daniels. So where does that all lead us, Marcos? I think that the answer is that if we count Kyler Murray as being about half this year of what Lamar Jackson and Jaden Daniels are, I think you can say it's justified. But if you take a look at other top quarterbacks around the league, we mentioned Burrow, Mahomes, even if you look at someone like a Josh Allen and his type of how he runs the ball, Kyler's probably more in that mid area than being kind of what I'd say is an elite rushing threat. I think that he's an elite threat, but being able to have, like you said, the high number of rushing attempts per game, staying healthy, and being able to have a lot of production, it's something that I think is a good question. Could it be better? I think that we could say, yeah. I think that maybe if you said, could we see the Cardinals, if they decided to run him 8 or 9 times a game, add an additional, let's say 3 runs per game, get him up to 7.5, would that be an improvement the Cardinals should make? Would the impact be good? Or do you think it would impact Kyler's health? And I think the biggest thing that from what we've kind of wondered about with Kyler is being a small quarterback, he is obviously when guys get in his face in front of, put their hands up so that he can't see, is something that we've seen in the past. Having some of those bootlegs, being able to get out, and then being able to actually have the ability to have some open spots in front of him to force defenses to respect his running ability. I think that I can agree and say, yeah, we'd love to see him run the ball more next year, but let's not necessarily go overboard versus, a much, I think it would say at least larger and thicker quarterback in Lamar Jackson, or even Jaden Daniels, who is pretty slender, but still is able to measure in at about 6'4", 210 pounds. All of those guys are a little heftier than Kyler, who at 5'10", and I think is 205, I think is probably what he weighs for the most part. He's a little bit lighter than the 207 that I think he's lifted at, but I think that is one of those cases of comparing apples to oranges. What I think the Cardinals need to do next year is improve their passing offense, which still stayed relatively Trey McBride and Marvin Harrison Jr. making up a bit more of their yards from a previous year ago. I think that that is the key, because those explosive plays through the passing game are things that we saw miss last year. I think that when that is the case, you'll see Kyler Murray maybe run for the same amount of yards, but have a higher yards per carry. That's what I would at least say would be your optimal place, because you will want to see Kyler play all 17 games. He finally did that last year. And this is a critical year for Kyler and the Cardinals overall, in which case you probably got to say, Marcos, would you risk it as far as running Kyler more this year? Or do you think this is the year you're going to risk it if you're Kyler Murray in Arizona?
Well, the interesting thing is he scrambles quite a bit. So those aren't designed, but he runs for large yardage when he scrambles. So it's kind of like, do you just let him do that at that point? Because I know you don't want him to run excessively because of the injury. And when you design a run, that means he's keeping the ball and he puts himself in a position where he could get tackled. Whereas if he does his usual scrambles when he's looking downfield, doesn't find anybody, and it decides to take off for the first down, he's more in vision of knowing what's going on. And he usually does it when it's in man coverage. So he knows he can run out of bounds. So he can control that run out of bounds. He can't control that if he's doing a design run and let's say he does a design run, and the defensive end or the edge defender is able to sniff out that bluff call that he has, and he comes after him, then he gets tackled. So I think just letting him scramble for now would be probably the optimal thing to do.
Yeah, I think that there's more design runs I'd love to be able to mix in, but like you said, there is limits to what a player's body can take. I think if you're going to say this is the year for the Cardinals to make the playoffs, depends on if your goal is, hey, we're going to make the playoffs, keep our quarterback healthy, kind of make some forward momentum with this team. That's going to be the goal. If you want to say this is a year in which everything is assembled now, you can evaluate Kyler Murray and say, is this the guy that we want moving forward? Or are we, as the Cardinals, going to try to see, hey, do we move off of him for 2026, take the cap hit? Do we commit to him for another year where even if he gets hurt, we're going to come back knowing that, hey, we're going to basically give this a 2-year trial window to see how it goes? Some fans, at least, are wanting to move on already. I think that at its core, what we'll want to see ultimately is a Kyler who goes out recognizing Arizona's wanting to win and is willing to put his body on the line for that, just like the rest of their guys, while at the same time, we don't want it to be a case where Kyler comes out in week 1 and you kind of end up in a lost season similar to what we saw to start 2023, where it took Kyler about 10 weeks or so to get back from that ACL injury. Let's go ahead and shift now into talking about the one of the more interesting cases, which is the Cardinals' top 30 visits. So with the Arizona Cardinals this year, they've had few players who have come in for the difference. Of course, there's combine visits. There's going to be what are called top 30 visits, where a player will actually fly out, visit the organization, visit everyone there. We've seen these from Josh Rosen and Kyler Murray before. They're things that happen pretty much every year. That's something I think we can look at. There was approximately, I think there was tons and tons of combine, private workouts, other visits next year. So teams are going to meet with everyone. We usually like to point out some of these because a lot of times what we will see is that when you have a guy who gets brought in by a top 20, I think it is a top 30, visit, a lot of times those are guys that they're going to be considering drafting in the top portions of the draft. So let's take a look here, at least with, I think that with some of their top 30 visits last year for the Arizona Cardinals, this is going to be tracked with through the difficult to use but still valuable Walter Football site. So we can see that we had guys last year that visited included Terry and Arnold, the cornerback, who ended up going after the Cardinals picked before their second pick of Darius Robinson. We know that they spent a top 30 pick on Braden Fisk, who went top of the second round. We know that they had a top 30 on Marvin Harrison Jr. that the team did end up drafting, as well as Max Melton, the cornerback who they drafted. We can see that some other players like Malik Neighbors they had in for a visit. They had Roma Dunze in, guys who were picking in some of that top 10 range for the most part. And then we can also at least say they had a guy like Chop Robinson and a Dadrian Taylor Demerson was in for a visit, along with Xavier Thomas, the defensive end. So what I think when it comes to these top 30 visits, what I think we can see from Arizona is you're not going to draft everyone who comes in, but those guys have a more realistic chance because it means the team's met with you at the combine, the team's worked you out, they're now bringing you into the building. These are guys that are probably going to be teams have stamped some of these guys. Doesn't mean they'll draft them, but you'll stamp them, and then you're kind of doing another check to see, is this someone we want to bring in to our organization, or we've got enough intrigue, we want to check you out and see how you're doing. That's something that I think we can say. We've got a couple of names on here that are familiar to Cardinals fans watching. We got some names that may be unfamiliar to Cardinals fans. But yeah, let's break down these, Marcos. Is there one that stands out to you particularly? Because I think Cardinals and Arizona State fans, there's one that stands out, but there's a couple others in this list as well.
Yeah, Will Johnson is the one that sticks out to me, and of course there's Cam Scattergood. That wouldn't have been a hard visit for him to do. But Will Johnson, there's been a lot of talks about which direction should we go with our first round pick. Should we go with the defensive end? Should we go with the tackle? Should we go with the corner? And I know the corner's been like kind of shunned away because the notion is that our problem last year wasn't the pass. Wasn't the pass defense, but I believe that you still need a alpha. You need somebody who's going to be your number one cornerback. And I get that we have Garrett Williams who plays in the slot. He's our apex, but you still have to have a perimeter cornerback out there. And to me, there's a reason why they're keeping him there for if they don't have any confidence with him going to the outside and whatnot. They'd rather him stick in the inside than give them some help on the outside. That's what the Eagles did last year when they drafted back-to-back cornerbacks. And I forgot what the first person's name was, but of course, the cornerback that they drafted in the second round was somebody that was really pulling for. He ends up playing in the slot as well, so really wouldn't have been that big of a difference for us if you really think about it. But they got themselves a perimeter guy, and they got themselves somebody in the slot. Both of them played tremendously well last year in coverage. So you still need your help at the outside. You're not gonna, bank on SMB having a solid season. He's getting up there in age, and I just don't trust like the cornerbacks outside of that because we still need to see more from Max Melton. We don't know what we have in him. We have flashes, but we don't know if he can sustain it. And starting Shepard is kind of like an up and down cornerback where he doesn't seem to give up like the big play, but he does give up quite a bit to like wide receivers underneath. So you need your outside guy, and that's where I would go if it was a pick. I wouldn't have any issues if they went defensive line on it, but I think Will Johnson's probably the pick.
Yeah, for that one, it seems like this is where the talent of Johnson seems to stand out. I think what we can say about him is the Cardinals still do need an alpha corner. At the same time, you can say that last year their corners and their secondary overall was probably the best part of their defense. They have revamped their defensive line up front, and edge rusher is kind of the area that still feels like it needs a little bit of juice in addition to Josh Sweat and B.J. Ojulari. Putting in a high pick may be able to count there. So I think that between Will Johnson being one of those corners, it would not shock me because you can say in the NFL you can never have enough corners. Good coverage, attacking the pass is helpful. But we've also seen that running the ball is in vogue as more teams get more corners, as secondaries kind of seem to be able to be better at pre-snap disguising of their coverages. That's why the Cardinals, when you take a look at what would be the one need that stands out the most, you're like, all right, I'm with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 edge rushers. Okay. Let's talk about the edge rushers here. So you've got the highest name that's going to be up there for the most part is probably going to be Jalen Walker, who is, and this is kind of where Cardinals fans can get a little bit concerned, kind of a hybrid off-ball linebacker / edge rusher, explosive, kind of runs through. A lot of Cardinals fans are going to think, oh no, this is a Zaven Collins, Hassan Reddick, a linebacker being moved to the edge, moved back to linebacker out of place. The comp that I think is closest for him, and it's not going to be the same level of production, but it'd be like a Micah Parsons, someone who did that same role at Penn State and was able to, I think it was I want to say it was like 10 plus sacks at least for the most part. I think it was in his college football career. That's where Jalen Walker, he's one of those guys that is more likely than not to be off of the board for the Cardinals, but he has been falling to them in some mock drafts. As far as when it comes to Nick Scourton, he's kind of most known as the Batman to, I should say the Robin to Shamar Stewart being the Batman. So Shamar Stewart is a edge rusher who is a conundrum because when you watch him on tape, he's explosive. He makes plays. He had one of the top 10 combine performances, maybe of the last decade. You talk about the workout that he had at the NFL Combine. He, at, I think it was 267 pounds, ran a sub 4.6 40-yard dash with a 1.58 10-yard split. Big broad jump at almost 11 feet. Vertical jump 40 inches, jumped out of the building. And he's 6'5", 267 pounds. You're like, oh my gosh, like, this guy is amazing. So you're going to say, well, if Shamar Stewart had this type of testing, and he's this edge rusher, he's supposed to go in the first round from Texas A&M, why isn't we talked about with Abdul Carter? Why isn't he talked about as being a number 1 pick? The answer for that, Marcos, is because in his career, he has had no more than 1.5 sacks per season. So you're like, oh. So you're like, is that going to be that there's technique? Is it finishing? How much of it is like saying something about the defense? And to be fair, that is going to be one of the things about why I think it's after Abdul Carter, it's kind of a buyer beware where each of the players that are following do have a flaw while still having that first round athleticism. On the other side of Shamar Stewart, at least here, and then we'll take a break, is going to be Nick Scourton. And I believe that Nick Scourton, when it comes to his combine profile, he also tested out to be... let me pull this up here overall. 6'3", 257, and I believe that he didn't actually work out at the Combine, but from what we were able to see, at least as far as for his production and overall score, he ended up being relatively athletic. So you're talking about like a guy who's got good power, still has quick steps, and is able to actually have like some good pass rushing moves. So maybe a little bit more experienced guy, maybe not quite a Marcus Golden type of prospect, but he ended up with 5 sacks this last year, 14 half tackles for loss. And you're talking about another guy who, hey, if you don't get Shamar Stewart, maybe you can get the guy across from him. A lot of teams seem to be liking these pass rushers, but it tells me maybe just Texas A&M's defense did not have a very good grip on how to get after the quarterback. So those are guys right now. Are there your thoughts on some of these players right now as we dig in before we head back to talking about the other 30 visits? Because gotta say, Marcos, Shamar Stewart could be on the board if the lack of sacks causes him to slip. Scourton, maybe that's a second-round target, unless you really like him in a large trade-back scenario. What are you thinking, at least overall? And then we'll talk about the other edge rushers that have a little bit of flaws with them coming up here in a sec.
Yeah, the sacks kind of scare me because I get that it's college and it's a different level, but you would expect for like a college player that's going to be ascending to the NFL to have like at least better production, because they're playing against like lesser talent down at the university. But I get they either see something on film that they like. There's something that gives off like, hey, this guy has the potential to be a top edge rusher in the league, because if you're going in the first round, you're supposed to be like a surefire person. So teams are looking at you like, yeah, we like this guy because he either has good bend, he has good strength, he has good speed and whatnot, and those will translate into the NFL. So with Stewart, you'd have to look at the games to see what happened there, because there could be a story where either he didn't finish like he wanted to, so that's why the sack numbers have been so low, and it's been so unproductive with that. And obviously that's why we have so many experts that like do these draft analysis and whatnot, and they tell you like, yeah, look, this guy's numbers jump off the screen. This guy prize of like somebody else that like he's projected to. Somebody is in the NFL that's very successful, so you see him in that, and you project that onto what you think he's going to be in the NFL. And if you're like, yeah, I'm taking him in the first round because I have confidence that he's like, not only because of his talent, but because of his leadership traits and because he's a hard worker, that he will become like not only a good starter, but maybe a Pro Bowler in the NFL. So I'm not sure about Shamar. I probably would just trade back at that point.
Yeah, it's one of those areas that, like you said, there's a risk and a reward that comes to it. One of the highest risks, at least overall, that we've seen is going to be with James Pierce Jr., the edge rusher out of Tennessee. He's a player who ran I believe it was 4.45 40-yard dash, and followed up with having a pretty underwhelming, I think it was like 33, something like that inches. It was very low as far as his vertical combine jump. And he had got back up to normal broad jump, but when he ran that 40, it was like, oh, okay, there's where some of that speed as far as for with the edge rushing and everything that they had for the most part. Now, what some of the areas are, at least this is part of with Bob McGinn, had written a piece on the edge class. He said that at Tennessee, it was like, hey, if you had a chance to bring someone to the league, would you bring him? And a lot of these guys went, nope. They're like, he's on his own program. The team's working out. He's on his apartment. They don't know where he was. One of the phrases that was used with him was uncoachable. There's two ways that you can look at this. One is, oh, it's all smoke. The other way is, well, there's smoke, there's fire. It's one of the places where when I watch him on his tape, you can see some of the speed rushing off of the edge that's super quick, being able to get there. But I don't see a lot of power. And he was one of the guys I watched, at least for this year, when looking at some of the complaints. And you can kind of study some of more of the highlights, watching deeper film. Some people will get deep into it. It was one of those places where he just was not necessarily the kind of guy that seemed like it fit the Jonathan Gannon model. As far as how did he do as far as with being able to go and make plays against the run? He got a lot of plays, at least with how he was spread out in that defense, getting a quick free run at the quarterback. Kind of one of those places where I would say, hey, he's got speed, but it's a little bit of a buyer beware. The other one that the Cardinals worked out that also is a little bit of a buyer beware could be Michael Williams, the Georgian edge rusher who last year we were talking about him as a potential number 1 overall pick, similar to Abdul Carter. He looked like he was explosive, incredibly quick. He also looked like he had a lot of the length, being 6'5", 35-inch arms, 260 pounds. Kind of fits into what you would look for as far as your productive and effective edge rusher. This last year, not nearly as good. He was almost non-existent. Now, he did say that he played through an injury this year and talked about how he weighed in at 267 pounds. He ran a 4.75 pro day run. He did skip the combine, said that he was hurt, might still be hurt. It's one of those areas that it's really going to be interesting to see with the 5 sacks and 9 tackles for loss. He was one of those players that you never really saw him kind of take that rise that we saw Will Anderson took. So Will Anderson was like, hey, this looks like one of the great players that could be in the draft next year. He comes back, repeats with another great season, goes number 3 overall with the Texans trading up for him. Michael Williams didn't quite get to that level this year. Battling through an ankle injury is obviously part of it. But it is one of those causes for pause whenever you have a guy that's injured that you draft as a player and you don't get to see some of the areas in testing. Cardinals fans, even we can say last year, Marvin Harrison Jr. came in, didn't work out at the combine. A lot of comments in that first week about him being slow. We do have a time of 4.75, and it's not saying it's the end of the world, especially if he's still recovering, but it is one of those moments of being cautious, and it's part of why Williams will be likely available at 16, and some project maybe even into the 20s. The other name that we can talk about at edge rusher is going to be Femi Oladipo. And I don't know as much about Femi, just going to be open and honest at least. He's one of the guys that you're going to be talking about. See, I'm even trying to remember his last name here. Diho. As far as when he was at, I think it was UCLA. Yes, it was UCLA was here. He was 6'3", about 33 inch arms, another 260-pound senior. Did have an okay vertical jump at 36 inches. I think actually that's pretty decent, at least for the most part, over 20 reps on the bench press. He's a guy who was a former linebacker who then gained some pounds and went to edge rush, but a lot more dynamic after that. He would be one of those like, hey, you don't get your round 1 edge rusher, but maybe you can get a guy like Baron Browning, was I think a round 3 or round 5 guy at least that you had for the Cardinals. Getting a guy like him on a cheap contract in round 3, what we'd hoped like a Myjai Sanders could have been, something that was like gone from that place. He also has some flexibility. He started at off-ball linebacker, so he's a guy that you'd be able to bring in off as an edge rusher, and you at least have ability to play through in coverage. Is able to use a good job with his hands. But there are areas, at least for the most part, where there's questions about technique, and then there's going to be some diagnosis like he's not the smoothest athlete. It's part of why he shifted away from that inside linebacker spot. But I think if you're talking about edge rushers, I would probably rather take a chance on him in day 2 than a James Pierce Jr., who may actually be like a more talented, more productive player on day 1. We're not talking here, interestingly enough, about one of the other top pass rushers in the draft. And that would be, I think it would be Mike Green out of Marshall. I think it is Mike Green, isn't it? Anyway, the reason why is that there's been sexual assault charges, there's character concerns that are going on. He would have to probably either be cleared or it'd be an unpopular pick. That's someone who the Cardinals have not brought in for a visit, but that's kind of the range that you'd be looking at. A similar range to Femi would be Prince Umanamiele, which is a very fun last name to say. He's from Ole Miss. He's one of those players that is probably also a potential day 2 guy. So you're talking about the Cardinals not going after trading up for a top edge rusher. Doesn't seem to be the plan. Seem to be looking at staying where they're put or trading back, maybe getting a guy in round 2 with a trade up. Princely is really interesting. He's about 6'4", 244 pounds, had 7 sacks, 12 sackles for loss. That's something I think that we'll be able to question is, he took a step back from what his previous year was. He'd been kind of gone as a first-round pick formerly. He seems like he'll probably be someone who goes on day 2 this year. Any other thoughts, at least, about the edge rushers, Marcos, before we kind of wrap that up and then kind of give our thoughts, at least, on the offensive side of the visits?
Well, they said this is going to be the deepest defensive tackle, defensive end or edge rusher, edge defender, and defensive tackle are deep this year. So
interior D-line, baby. This is a deep year for that, not as deep at edge.
And the quarterbacks aren't as talented, with the exception of like having like Cam at the number 1 overall pick, and then nobody knows where Shador is going to go. So it's going to be kind of weird. I think it's going to happen where the quarterback's going to be the first overall pick. After that, it's going to be defensive picks. That's all it's going to be. It's going to be like last year, where last year there was offensive picks until pick 15, and but the way they're talking about defense this year, I think that's how it's going to be. It's just going to be a heavy defensive first round. Um, and I'm not going to lie, a lot of these defensive or edge defenders, they put the same tape on film, or they at least are able to have like good measurables to be able to be considered, and people get excited about them. But we all know that the first guy or the second guy, those elite guys, the ones we can't get our hands on, we all know that those are going to be the ones most likely to pan out in the NFL. And after that, you're just hoping to God that the guy you drafted is either going to have good character, he's going to be a hard worker, or he's going to end up becoming like a Pro Bowler. So for me, James Pierce, I would take a chance on him. Jalen Walker, once again, kind of like a hybrid, but I guarantee you he's going to be one of those players that is going to be a Sam linebacker where you drop him into coverage because he's able to, he's athletic enough to cover like a Hassan Reddick, and you're going to rush him on, the opposite side of wherever the bandit's going to be. And I might want to consider him, knowing that like you could still have success from those type of linebackers as long as you place them on the defensive line.
Yep. No, I think that's a good take at least to have with him. The last two guys we'll get to here as we start to wrap up are going to be Anthony Belton. Absolutely massive, 6'6", 336 pounds, large hands, a little bit shorter arms, not quite 34 inches, but it's not like you're 32 inches. The question I have with this is when you take a look at the athleticism, it's not going to be quite the athleticism that we've seen them draft for interior offensive linemen. They like more athletic guys, like a John Gaines. You can look at his 3-cone a little bit quicker, similar for the vertical jump, and then the 40-yard dash was a bit more effective. When it comes to, let me go back here to Anthony Belton, it's going to be a little step behind. I think this is a guy that instead of being a day 2 or round 4 guy, maybe it's a guy that goes a little bit later, but with some of that size. If we wanted to talk about adding a guy who could potentially push a Christian Jones, who the Cardinals drafted last year. And I think Christian Jones, unless I'm mistaken at the Combine, he actually did test out to be pretty athletic overall. He was a longtime starter for, I want to say, Texas. So maybe it's one of those guys that you bring in to be able to say, hey, like, if we're looking for someone that Christian Jones is a little smaller at 305 pounds, can we bring in a guy who's a little bit bigger? Who's 30 pounds heavier, is running a 5.26, jumping about 29 inches, and then running a 3-cone drill. If you add that 30 pounds from here into what Christian Jones ran, and he's going to have similar athleticism, like maybe you say, hey, he drops 300 pounds. He's able to line up. He's suddenly going to stick out there like a sore thumb. Maybe it's one of those guys that you can say, hey, we could put him in as a road grader on the interior if we like the size with some of that length. But honestly, you could probably just keep him out there at tackle, have kind of your more athletic, smaller offensive tackle try and your slightly larger offensive tackle try. That's one of the reasons I think that they could also bring him in from NC State. And, of course, the last one is someone that Cardinals fans are very familiar with in Scam Catabo, who had a fantastic combine outside of one area. He did not run the 40-yard dash. He was timed at least about 4.6 seconds officially, according to scouts, which is about where he was expected. But he's come in as extremely athletic. So you're talking about compact build, weighing about 220 pounds. Not going to be anything more than one of the best players in Arizona State football history. Being Tempe in the backyard, people are very familiar with how successful their season was. He's not anything less than one of the best players in ASU football history. He jumped 39.5 inches, was a very explosive sort of jump that he had, as long as a good broad jump. And at that 4.6, he is a little bit smaller than a James Conner, even though he weighed in at 219. James Conner, when you're talking about him as an athlete, he's just a different type of animal overall in the combine, because he's 6'2" and he weighs, I think, another 10 pounds heavier when he came into the league at 6'1" and 233 pounds. So this is a guy who's different than anything you've got in your roster. He's going to be probably more similar to James Conner as a runner, but he's going to probably have a little bit more size, closer to maybe an MRD Mercado, but with more explosive traits. So Trey Benson was a guy who ran fast for the Arizona Cardinals. This is a guy who did not run quick. So the question then is, does he fit on the Cardinals? Where could he fit? Should they even take a running back that high, or do you go, you're good with James Conner, you're good with your backup in Trey Benson, you're good with having the likes of Michael Carter, Amari DiMercato, and of course DJ Dallas as your kick returner? Or is this someone that you think the Cardinals could end up taking, Marcos, and add to kind of this local legends that they've seen with the likes of, formerly, it's hard to name someone like a Pat Tillman, but other Cardinals players who've gone to Arizona State and have gone on to have productive NFL careers, have gone elsewhere. There's also a special place in people's hearts for those like a Jake Plummer who did play for both organizations as well.
Yeah, you had that guy that, what was the coach's name? I forgot what his name was, Dylan Shaw. I'm not sure, but he had said that all the Cardinals need to do at this point is just draft Cam Scatterboo. People got that into their minds that at that point maybe we should just try to keep him in house, mostly because of the fact that one, he's a running back that could come into the into our running back room and stuff, and he could be somebody that, he's probably going to go in the third round. So will people want to value him that high? That's going to be the question. Do you want to spend a third round pick? I personally would, mostly because of the fact that James Conner is getting up there in age. And yes, I know he's still productive. His running style is going to be the type of running style where he's going to last longer because it's not built on speed. It's built on vision. It's built on making, the right reads. So it's more of studying the film and, making sure you make the reads fast enough. Some running backs can't do it. We have no idea what's going to happen with Trey Benson. He's explosive, but his vision hasn't really been there as far as being able to hit the right gaps or hit the right holes or do the right reads. Cam Scatterboo, although he's not a battering ram, he's one of the people that lowers his shoulders, absorbs contact, and kind of bounces off. So kind of like a Genty type of running back, not as talented, but just kind of the same way. You hit him, you got to bring him down by his legs. If not, he's just going to drop that last center of gravity, and he's just going to bounce off that tackle.
Yeah, with how they drafted Trey Benson last year, I said that if you're not going to take a running back last year, you're going to have to draft one a lot higher this year. This is a very deep running back class, as we'll get into. There's going to be anywhere from, I will say, maybe, I think there's going to be anywhere from, I want to say about 20. It seems like it's going to be potentially too much, but you're talking at least about Ashton Genty being a potential top 10 pick. You got Marion Hampton, as long as Christian Judkins, and that's not even counting a large David Johnson type back in Caleb Johnson, who's not going to be as quick as David Johnson, but has similar 6 foot size at 6 foot, 225 pounds. Maybe you look at that. The one that I liken him to as far as prospects go is a little different than what people have. And he actually went right in that range that you're talking about of the third round, maybe a little bit high, but that would be the current Lions and former Bears running back, David Montgomery. So you look at David Montgomery, good runner, able to be effective, gets maybe 10 touchdowns a season. He ran in the 4.63 40-yard dash at the combine. Didn't have the same vertical jump, but still had a good broad jump overall. You want to compare that to Cam Scatterboo, and you can say, yeah, Scatterboo is more explosive in terms of his runs. He's also going to be maybe a little tiny bit smaller, 5'10", 222. He's about 10 pounds lighter than that. So you're talking at least about finding somewhere in between the likes of a athlete like James Conner, who we can talk about at least of having that similar 40 speed of 4.65, but add another 10 to 15 pounds heavier, and then a little bit smaller back at least. there's guys who come into the league that are like Trey Benson, who are a lot quicker. They run a 4.39 40-yard dash, but aren't quite as I think you can say with the breaking tackles and his vertical jump. That stands out here. The other thing that I think fits, like you said, is the character and the personality, is a very Monty Austin-Forth, Jonathan Gannon style. He would come in, instantly be your running back 3 to start the year, would be making plays on special teams, and would probably get a spell at least of, hey, we're going to bring you in, Cam. You're going to be the fullback on this play, blocking for James Conner. And he'll line up there, blow someone off of the ball, and be able to get there. The question, of course, is where is worth taking a running back? I think with you, round 4 is the one that makes the most sense. Perhaps he does end up going in round 3. It's a case where the Cardinals may just have their eyes on different players and talents as well. I think that's kind of that sweet spot where if you really, really love the kid, maybe you take him round 3, but more likely than not, I think that 40 time could make him fall to round 4, similar to how it did James Conner. Conner ended up coming out of college after, I believe it was the cancer diagnosis, and he wasn't the fastest guy in the building, but he's outperformed guys for years and years. So it's one of those places where we'll have to see. The one piece of intel that I do know is that there's someone in the Cardinals front office who is not necessarily the biggest fan of Cam Scadaboo, at least to begin with. Now, when Scadaboo visits, perhaps like the Cardinals owner is going to be a little bit more open to the idea, because that's what happened with other guys in the past. Like they had Josh Rosen, Christian Kirk visit on the same day. That was like the afternoon that they got sold and saying, all right, we're good with taking Josh Rosen, trading up for him. This will be our guy. Maybe a poor example since Josh is out of the league as it stands, but that's how things can go in the National Football League. Sometimes it's all about not just where you're drafted, but how you perform. Let's go ahead now and finish up now with a final mock draft simulation. So, Marcos, we're going to pull up the old PFF mock draft simulator, and we'll talk a little about some of the picks that are going in this mock, whether we think they're good or not, before we make a couple of selections for the Cardinals. They've got the Browns taking a quarterback at 2, and you're seeing at number 3, the 2 quarterbacks are gone, so the Giants are going with a defensive lineman. That causes Abdul Carter to slip all the way down to pick 4, and Travis Hunter, who I think is a very good chance to make it there on draft day, is there available at 5. Wouldn't shock me to see Ashton Gianti go at 6. And then you got some other guys like Will Campbell seems to be mocked in the top 10 consistently. Jahdae Barron's been a late name that's kind of flown up draft boards. Armand Membo seems to be the most athletic tackle in this draft. We got a couple of guys who maybe have a chance of falling to the Arizona Cardinals here. It would not be Shamar Stewart would be one of those you can see who we can pick this time. But you got guys like Tet McMillan, Matthew Golden, and even Jihad Campbell, the kind of create a linebacker going over here to the Bears. Here's our board and how it stacks right now, Marcos. There is definitely some intrigue for all of the names that I think you can see here on this board. What kind of need do you think would fit the Cardinals?
Well, like I said, I'm going to go, what I would is Will Johnson. But given the fact that we also added to our defensive line, which obviously bolstered up with Calais Campbell being there, having a big sign of Josh Sweat. I mean, you're really like rolling the dice here, but it's hard for me to do that because James Pierce is right there. If James Pierce was not available, I probably would just consider just taking him over Will Johnson. But we need that also cornerback. So for me, I'd just stick with Will.
Yeah, with Will Johnson being there, that does seem to be the case. We do have a couple of trade-up offers. So we've got pick 23 with the Packers, pick 24 with the Vikings. Dallas Cowboys are all the way down at 44. That seems pretty unlikely. Do you think that, Marcos, it'd be worth if the Cardinals get an offer for someone to move up? My guess is that one of these teams, Packers or Vikings, would be making that move up for a corner. Packers replacing Jair Alexander, and the Vikings could use a cornerback this year. Vikings only have, I believe, 4 draft picks. They would be kind of going all in on one of their getting one good player and then having maybe 2 picks the rest of the draft. I think that there's a possibility if their guy's not there, they could trade back from 24. Would you say, at least looking at the board, that you would take a look at trading back? Because you got Will Johnson on the board, James Pierce on the board, Kenneth Grant is out there, who I still like. I know some people are not as much fans of him, but we see nose tackles being very effective in the NFL. And then Josh Simmons, who we know his coach, he's played with Paris Johnson. He's coming off of a rough injury. We can see that he's still available, as well as Kelvin Banks Jr. and Emeka Egbuka. To me, you put all this together, I got to say I'm probably going to be looking at trading back for the most part. And I think that the question is Will Johnson worth taking at 16 over trading back for, let's say that the Packers trade up for, they give us a 3rd-round pick for that trade up from 16 to 23. What are your thoughts, Marcos?
Well, 23 is not a bad number. If we roll the dice, I would go over for 23 instead. So let's go ahead and trade back and let's see who they got.
Yeah, let's do that. So we're going to give up at least, I think, here, only to pick 16 and get back 23 and 87. Let's do a 2026 swap at least of a 5th rounder and a 4th rounder for next year. We'll go ahead and offer that trade, and there we go. So now the Packers, of course, they did trade up and took Will Johnson right there. You see Michael Williams, Kenneth Grant, Josh Simmons all off of the board. Mike Green, Jalen Walker, and Walter Nolan also gone. Here it looks like you're going to have, from what I see, there is 2 options that really stand out. You got Pierce Jr., and you've got Kelvin Banks Jr., the offensive tackle. So the question here now is, Do you think that there's an offensive tackle or an edge rusher worth taking in round 2 that can help? Because as we've gone over on this podcast, part of the reason we like Josh Simmons is because there is a possible chance that the Cardinals are going to have their starting offensive tackle in Jonah Williams, not under contract next year. Kelvin Beachum very likely could retire. So you're looking at Christian Jones or a rookie. So getting an offensive tackle in who could potentially play guard for year 1, then maybe shift out, or even just having that gap year like DJ Humphries did as a rookie. We saw Humphries have I think it was 8-year career with the Cardinals after that, despite sitting for the whole season. But we also have the edge rusher who's there on the board, and I have to say, Marcos, in this spot, I would probably look at the defensive lineman Harmon because I like him a little bit more, but I would have no issues if we wanted to go ahead and say, yeah, let's go ahead here, take the likes of the edge rusher that's still available. You said you want to roll the dice on him. I think we can go ahead and we'll go with what you say on that spot. All right, now we got our next pick at least coming up now for the Cardinals. So we've got a couple of good players who have gone. You can see at least Ibuka, Tyler Brooker, a guy that's been mocked to the Cardinals, Gray Zabel, who's probably going to be a guard, goes in the mock draft. Josh Connerly, one of my favorite tackles in this draft. If the Cardinals trade back way in the first round, that would be a target that I would love for them. You're going to end up seeing an edge rusher, Landon Jackson, goes off of the board, a defensive lineman in Tyleik Williams. Now we've got an interesting thing to set up here because you can take a look at right now. We've got Scadaboo, who's probably ranked a little higher than he'll go, but maybe a team falls in love. You got a larger guy, I think, in a Jaden Higgins at receiver, who at 6'4", 215 is one of those guys that the best way to describe him is imagine him as being if Michael Wilson was healthy to play all 17 games a season. He's not as quick as far as being a deep speed threat, though, like Jalen Noel, his teammate. And the same goes with Jack Becht, I think, at least, who is another larger receiver at 215 pounds. He's got great hands, very reliable. I think in this spot here, unless you really want to go with the linebacker, this to me feels like you could just double up on edge rushers if you're the Arizona Cardinals. The other one that I like here in this specific area would be Carson Schwessinger. So Schwessinger, he's a guy that when you're looking at the size, 6'2", he's a little bit light, but his intelligence, his speed, and you look at his 3-cone that popped up, it wasn't quite elite as some people were saying from what they hand timed, but it was good enough that you're talking about a guy who could be a long-time Mike starting linebacker for you. That's really kind of what it looks like for here. I don't think we're going to be looking at having another potential trade back. Do you have someone that you like here that stands out to you in this spot, Marcos? Would you follow up with another receiver? Would you go for a edge rusher in JT Tuilamolau, or would you take the guy the Cardinals have had visit before in Prince Emmanuel?
Well, I wanted to look for corner, but I'm not really familiar with the corner class this year, aside from the first rounders.
Small school guy, and the Cardinals have not actually, they called him, he's an athletic alien at 6'3", 193, but there's a lot of just inconsistent anticipation technique. What we did see with the Cardinals in the past, they would take a round 2 or round 3 corner, but this is a huge adjustment. He's going from the AAC, not the ACC, the AAC. We've not seen the Cardinals draft a small school guy like outside of I think maybe the one in Monty Austin for earlier than that. And like we can see with a lot of the corners, Maxwell Hairston gone. Looking back at, I think the other cornerback that I remember up there was, it was a safety in Nika Manowari. So let's see the corners who are still left here. Yeah, you're going to be looking at AP rank 43, 53. When it comes to the offensive linemen or the offensive tackles, Marcus Mbao is someone who I think is that typical goes in round 3 and starts for somebody for a long period of time. But at the end of the day, I think in this spot, for the most part of me would like the Ohio State guy, is saying you can go back-to-back edge rushers. He's going to be essentially what I would call the opposite of he's going to be less speed, way more power when it comes to being able to rush the passer. He's a little bit shorter in his arms, but overall he's able to play through. You get what you're getting with Ohio State for the most part. And he's not quite as flexible as other guys. Like the stiffness is part of why he's not like a first-round type of guy. But he overall is one of those guys that when you're talking about being able to be an edge rusher with size and being able to stop the run, he's up there as well. This is an interesting spot for Arizona because if I have to be honest with it, one or two of these guys that came off the board in a Donovan Jackson, a Tyleik Williams would have been guys I would have probably preferred personally. But in this spot, for me, I'm going to take Schwessinger and just say, you know what, if the Cardinals drafted a stud linebacker under Austin Fort and Gannon before, No, they have not. Now you would get a guy who can come in as a rookie, be able to make plays. I think that's going to be worth it. And I do think that I would take that over in this slot. I don't think it's realistic for Cam Scatterbo to go, and I don't think that he would be a guy you would draft earlier than that. So realistically, maybe we talk about Princely, but I think we'll go Schlesinger here. Or Schweissinger.
Schlesinger, I believe he was one of the gems on the bootleg.
Absolutely. He is a definite gem there. You get back to us being on the clock. We've taken our edge rusher and we've taken our, I want to say linebacker. So you can look at other positions like wide receiver, a defensive lineman. To me, this one is pretty much no question. I'm going to be taking a look at Chris Paul Jr. is up there at least. He's one of the linebackers that I like in this range. If he falls to the next day, maybe it's fine, but he's definitely a little bit lighter and very, very light. So it's one of the spots of can he put on a little bit of weight? He's got the intelligence for that one. Though this one to me is pretty easy though. Marcus Embo, when you're talking about him, he's a 300-pound guy at 6'5" for the most part, so it's a little bit smaller than usual. But when you talk about it being able to start at guard, he's one of those guys that with the way that he moves for the most part, he just moves fast. He's explosive. He also is able to kind of hit. He just needs a little bit of strength, I think, in the weight room is something that will be super helpful. And he's, like they said, more impactful as a zone blocker than as a man gap blocker. The Cardinals' bread and butter is the counter play. That involves your guard, your tackle, someone picking up, going back behind, running to another spot on the line and hitting a guy to open up a hole for the running back to run through. He's one of those players, at least, that I think he's got the character that everyone's looking for is another thing people rave about with him. I would take Marcus Embow here and then just say, cool, we got an interior offensive lineman we're taking in round 3, pairing with the other guys with one way or another, we're going to get a starter from those spots. We've got another pick that's happening now here. And Tate Ratledge was available. I was looking at Jalen Noel, would have probably been one of the picks. Maybe you could kind of flip these two, but he's a small slot receiver at 5'11", 200 pounds. And he is not good at long speed. And he's got strong hands for the most part, at least. But it's one of those places where when you're talking about some of these guys and how they could end up panning out, some guys you kind of take a chance on to come up. The other one that I like in this spot here is Jordan Phillips overall. He's a former wrestler. One of my techniques for drafting a guy is if they're a former wrestler, they get leverage, strength, they know how to be able to make weight. He was a college football freak that had a 665-pound squat. Would not shock me at all if he's one of those guys. We'll take him for the Cardinals here at pick 87. Now we'll get back down. Once you get out of the first 120 picks, it's really difficult to be able to see guys who are there. The guy who I like in this range is Kobe Bryant, the ball hawk at, I think it was Kansas is where he played. He ended up with 4 interceptions this past year, and he's just super aggressive, super fun to watch, a little lighter at 175, and is still named after the actual Kobe Bryant for the most part. He's near the lowest weight percentile for an NFL cornerback, so he's a little bit of an outlier. But he's physical. He's got that attitude. Like when you talk about that attitude we saw them take from Wanting Buda Baker, from Rabbit, from Jalen Thompson, he fits that mold. He would be probably the guy I would take here. Will Howard is a unique name. Maybe that's one of those guys that you would say, hey, we've seen enough from Clayton Tune. We want another quarterback 3. I think that, and with how you're built right now with Jacoby Brissett as your backup, unless you really feel like it, taking another quarterback with a top 120 pick does not make sense. I would say we passed on cornerback in the first round to be able to take our edge rusher. Let's go get a cornerback here that I think could be a steal in Kobe Bryant. And we're going to have at least 2 picks left with the Cardinals. We'll just get through these pretty quickly in the late rounds. We're going to take a look at least over here. And yeah, you got like another halfback in Trevor Etienne, at least someone who actually I think is didn't run as fast as his brother, but we're going to go ahead and say that that's one of those guys who could push for running back spot 3. And we've got our last final pick at 225. Let's see, fingers crossed on who's going to be the lucky guy at the top. All we're going to do is not draft a kicker. That's something we're not going to do here on the Redbird Reboot podcast. We've got a bunch of quarterbacks. We got Luke Lachey, the tight end out of Iowa, who looked really great and then got hurt, but he's not as quick, not as strong. At 6'6", 250. We're just going to roll the dice on like one of the last picks that we have there. and that is going to be our mock draft for the evening. So let's go ahead and renew how we address the needs for Arizona. We have an edge rusher. Marcos and I had some disagreement about drafting, but we said we're going to roll the dice here after trading back. A new linebacker, the highest that we've seen Monty take. We have a new tackle who's probably going to move to guard, a defensive lineman, a cornerback who's able to at least fill in. And then, of course, you round that out with another halfback to upgrade running back 3 and a final tight end. This is something that we are having a fun time, at least, with all of the pre-draft build-up. Guys, you'll be able to follow us for much more of that at Redbird Reboot. Hoping to have a nice special guest on next week to talk Cardinals. But that's it for us. For the meantime, Marcos, if you can shout out where our listeners, and for those of you watching, can find us on our social media accounts and on YouTube.
So you can find, obviously, the podcast. I would love for you guys to look through it through YouTube, Redbird Reboot. Obviously, that way you can get in the chat, be able to put your questions, have some interactions with us and whatnot. We love that. Also through X at Pancake Soul, you'll see it right here. There you go. See it right there. Just follow. You guys want to shoot a question, just go ahead. And of course, Blake Murphy 7, he has his handle on X, and obviously you know where to find Redbird Reboot now.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Hey, Cardinals have now rebooted their franchise by adding a new player to a huge contract in Trey McBride, and they've also added in a huge playmaker back to the fold in Calais Campbell. It's something that's super exciting and super looking forward to celebrating that. We'll wrap it up by looking at Trey McBride celebrating his recent signing from the Arizona Cardinals. He tweeted out, man, how we feeling? Let's go. That is exactly how Cardinals fans are feeling. That's how we're feeling here on the Redbird Reboot podcast. Thanks again, everyone, and go Cards. Have a great week.